good morning. And so, look, I'll make a very brief introduction on myself, and then I'll kind of jump right into just a couple minutes of remarks before we open up to Q&A. So, my research expertise is mostly on the investment side, and behavioral finance and innovation, but I get interested in this actually through this investment management side. So, I teach this course called Investment Strategy. So, it's a second-year course for MBA students, and it focuses mostly on investments. So, we give them kind of a good assessment and a good kind of, I guess, introduction to lots of different types of investments. So you could think quantitative and qualitative, and then we do a little macro and HFT, and we just give them a feel for what investments are like. And when I saw this litigation finance, I thought this was a really neat investment, and I wanted to dig into it more. And so I gave it on my final. It was just this New York Times article I saw on it. I would give it on my final, and I just had students assess it, right, in some kind of open form. Assess this as an investment, right? What's good about it? What's bad about it? What might you have to worry about? And I had a ton of students come up to me afterwards, and they said, Professor Cohen, why did you put that question on the final? We spent all of our time on that question, and then we didn't get any other questions done. And so I could see immediately that this is something that they were fascinated with and wanted to learn more about. And so with that as my kind of ammunition, I've now written a few Harvard Business School cases on litigation finance, and so for a couple firms and how they think through litigation finance and what are the challenges and other types of issues they face. Okay, and so given that, I want to say kind of three things. Okay, and I want you to take just three things from these couple minutes. And so I will start it with just the following motivation, and that is a mortgage, a stock certificate, and T-bill. Okay, so I'm not having a stroke. Okay, I know those are just words, but what do they have in common? Those are legal contracts that underlie trillion or tens of trillion dollar markets, right? And so the question is, what do all of them have in common? Right? What do all these contracts have in common? Why is that informative? Well, look, we could look at markets that have failed, but that's probably not helpful. If we want to see what these kinds of contracts have in common, to get a good look at what might be promising and what we need from a legal contract to make a financial instrument that people want to invest in and invest in at some scale. Now, do I think litigation finance has the promise to be as large as these markets? Well, no, I don't think any of us would think that that's true. I think that the fundamental roof and the fundamental cap on this market is probably a bit smaller. And that being said, there are some things that all of these markets have in common, and not only these markets, but successful markets for financial instruments more generally have in common, okay? And I want to highlight three things that are missing from the current litigation finance market that need to exist for this market to grow. For this market to grow, to fulfill the promise that I think all of us believe it has, not only all of us, but all of you, which is why you're here today. And those three things are standardization, okay, more standardization of the contract, transparency, and regulation, regulatory oversight, okay, STR. So we just remember three things, STR. Standardization in the terms. Now look, there's going to be some bespoke aspects of this, but if everyone has to look and dig through every contract and every one for individual things, it can never grow, okay? Transparency. Okay, people can't believe that the other side's always trying to hoodwink them and that they're going to need hours, weeks, days to evaluate each of these. Then you're never going to get the volume and velocity you need to grow the market. And third, some bit of regulatory oversight. Okay, there needs to be someone from the outside, someone that we can both trust, that's a kind of referee in this market. Okay, every large market that has flourished has had these three things, and this market's going to need them too. All right, and with that, I will pass it on to the next person. We're looking forward to your questions. Thanks.
Fabulous.
I'm not going to wander around the room, so. Thanks. It's very interesting. My name's Wynn Morris. I work for Arrowhead Capital. Arrowhead Capital is what I would describe as a nuts and bolts litigation, commercial litigation funder in today's market, which doesn't have standardization, does not have transparency, and we don't have any regulatory oversight. So I think I represent where the market is today, and I can speak about it for the audience for where we are. I'm not quite sure where we are going, But certainly, what Lawrence pointed out, to get to be a bigger market, we are certainly going to need to have all of the, what is it, STR, that's our acronym of the day. Right. There are, in today's market, there's commercial litigation funding, and then there is retail litigation funding. And a lot of the regulation and need and the abusive practices have occurred on the retail side, where you're looking at individual plaintiffs who are monetizing their claims, typically personal injury folks who have a claim that is very measurable, and they're brought in, funders come in and provide an advance for their injuries and charge a high rate of interest, and then the settlement comes through and people are rightfully outraged that the funder and the lawyer walks off with the settlement and the claimant walks off with very little. In commercial litigation funding, generally you have a more sophisticated audience, and we do, I think, as an industry, pride ourselves in providing access to justice for the small company. So if you look at our typical client at Arrowhead Capital, we're helping out a small family-owned company, perhaps, that is fighting a battle against a defendant who has oodles more money and whose game plan is delayed. So you bring a litigation funder into the mix, and all of a sudden you've helped maybe not equalize the playing field, but at least make it a little less imbalanced. So where we see our role is to provide the resources for a smaller company to do battle against a bigger company, and hopefully, if all turns out well, we'll make a ton of money, as will the plaintiff, who otherwise would not have a case. So certainly our view is that we're providing a necessary service. We're not taking advantage of anybody who is not willing to, oh, that's my parking expiring, who's would otherwise not have a case, basically. There are other reasons why people use litigation funding, we can talk about that, but the number one reason is to get your day in court or your day in arbitration that you otherwise would not be able to do because you couldn't afford to hire a lawyer to do it. So I'll just stop right there and go for the questions.
Should we do like questions on the panel and then open it up to the, yeah? I mean, it seems like there's a tension, right, between what you said and what you said. Namely that if we standardize and regulate, then it's becoming much harder to have the kind of customization that you might need to help an individual plaintiff with their individual problems and needs, right? So I don't know, how would you envision resolving that tension? One way is to regulate differently for retail and commercial, but even then, it seems that there's a lot of customization and a lot of tailoring that's needed. So how would the regulation look like? Maybe there are other areas where we've done this before. I don't know.
Yes, yeah. So I'm happy to jump into this. So look, I think that's exactly right. So I think there are parts of these contracts that can be standardized, and there are parts that can't, right? But we can certainly create frameworks within which we can kind of live and standardize. In other words, we can say, okay, here are the sections of every one of these securities. So each one of these securities are going to have these 5 sections, right? And they're going to talk about the type of case, they're going to talk about the likely duration, they're going to talk about all these things which someone within finance would want to know about, or someone who wanted to invest in this would want to know about it, because look, at the end of the day, there's nobody who's foolish enough to invest all their capital in this, right? So I can tell you this, there are lots of right answers to the exam question that I gave about this as an investment strategy. Anyone who said put 100% of your capital in this, that's a wrong answer, right? And so when you say there are lots of right answers, it doesn't mean every answer is right. That answer is wrong. And so what people need to think about is how this fits into a portfolio, okay? And this does have a lot of attractive properties fitting into a portfolio, right? It has super, super positive correlational properties, right? In the sense that in theory it's uncorrelated with lots of other things, and that it can help you diversify across industries, across geographies, across lots of different things, and even has nice duration properties, at least if you invest in the right cases. And so I think those are all great. That being said, if this contract is so bespoke such that it fits everything, if every case really is its own special little snowflake, then no snowflakes fall on the, this is a terrible analogy, but you get the idea, right? That like essentially no one's gonna have the time and it will be cost prohibitive to invest in these things. I think actually standardization will allow many more people to get justice, right? It's gonna move down the potential costs and the kinds of cases you can invest in, because I could invest in 100 smaller cases because I can invest in them very quickly, right? And I can push on them very quickly. And so I'll give you one other market, which is actually quite similar to, which I've also done quite a bit of work in, and I've done a bunch of expert witnessing and talked to a lot of people in DC, and that is the life settlement market, for the secondary market for life insurance. And that market has had this huge failure to launch for a number of years, and one of the things it's now doing is trying to standardize. And that standardization has allowed it to move to smaller life insurance policies. So it's allowed it to help more people by allowing it to now provide liquidity for people with $200,000 or $300,000 face policies. And I know that if the same thing were to happen here, then you could actually broaden this and help many more people.
So let's talk a little bit about the market as it exists today from the investor point of view in litigation funding. If you want to invest in litigation funding, you can do it either by buying stock in a public company. Burford is a public company in the UK.
By the way, I should mention, Burford is, my case is on Burford, so I know the Burford guys very well.
Oh, very well.
The HBS case, yeah.
Top-notch folks. The market leader, I think, without a doubt, in litigation funding as far as the amount of money that is out there. They had a larger competitor, which they went out and bought so they could stay number one. If you are so you can buy stock in that company. You can go to web-based platforms. There's an outfit called LexShares, which is online, and you, if you're an accredited investor, can go and buy an interest in a case. And you can review the case and you can put in the amount of money that you want to put in, which can be, I think, as little as $5,000 or something like that. Or you can do what is probably the most typical route, which is to invest in a fund or a company that operates a fund, somewhat like our outfit at Arrowhead. And it becomes a venture capital investment. And then, so if you look the next layer, who is doing that investing? And it's exactly this. These are folks who are looking for uncorrelated investments. And by uncorrelated, we mean investments that don't rise up and down with the capital markets. They're certainly correlated to the outcome in the cases that are ultimately managed by that fund or invested in by that fund. And this has become an incredibly popular asset tool. And I'd say one of the things that is facing the industry right now is the huge cash rush of money that is going into these cases that are not standardized. And the executions are bespoke, and there is today, arguably, a lot of money chasing cases that may or may not work out in the end. As part of a diversified book of business, it's fine to risk some of your money, but other than someone who is in it day to day, I wouldn't go all in.
Yes, and let me make one other point on this, and I think that it belies this expertise point you bring up. So, and we'll do it with an anecdote here, okay, or an example. I'll ask a question, actually. So how many people in this room are invested in Apple? Anyone? Okay, great. What about Amazon? Amazon? Pfizer, anyone here? Pfizer, Merck? Okay, we've got some. Now, look, how many of us have degrees in computer science or engineering? Okay, one. What about in biotechnology? Any doctors? Yeah, not many of us, right? But we can still invest in these things. And the way we're able to still invest in these things is that they've been standardized to the point that we now get enough information on them that we feel comfortable that, gosh, we have the whole story, or at least enough of the story that we feel comfortable in saying, gosh, I want to invest in this security and I don't want to invest in something else. And so in this market, right, we need some way in order for investors to get comfortable with that, right? To get comfortable that, gosh, we're getting the information that we should be getting and that we trust. We trust that we have enough that we're investing in the good cases and we're not being hoodwinked, right? We're not being just pushed into these cases that never should have been funded ex ante, right? And so that's a big part of this, right? Is that trust in the process and the amount of information being provided needs to be large enough. And if not, what's going to happen in this market, and maybe it's already happening, and so this is interesting, is that in the life settlement market, they got over their skis, right? And so they had too much capital chasing essentially what were really bad quality policies, and they blew up in these investors' faces. And then the policies, then the whole investment class was hurt by that because investment returns were lower than it should have been, but that didn't imply that there was somehow an oversupply of capital because there were many good policies out there that remained underfunded. And so that's my question back to you. This fact that there's supply chasing bad cases, right, or bad assets, does that imply that there's too much capital or just that the capital isn't matching correctly?
Well, I think that if you're going to invest in commercial litigation, every case is unique and has a unique story to it. And so what you're really investing in is the manager's expertise. And the manager's going to take your money and they're going to put it in an investment, and in turn, they're going to be investing in, and to use Selvin's phrase, the horse and the jockey. Okay, the horse is your case that you're investing in, the jockey is the law firm. And you as the cash investor are so far away from the process that the notion that you can successfully be the person who has the expertise to figure that out is in my mind, pretty far-fetched and not really something that an amateur ought to try. You wouldn't, you know, you want your surgeon to have done your type of surgery at least one time before. I think the issue today is, as we see it, and we've been in this business, a quote-unquote long time, which is since 2012, is do you as an investor want to entrust your money to folks who are just getting into the business? And is that the right thing to do? Are all the incentives aligned between you, the investor who has put money in, the funder to whom you're giving the money, and then eventually between the funder and the cases that are managed? And it's tough, you know. And that is different than investing directly in cases. And I'm only, for the regular person who is looking to do an investment, I'm only familiar with the with the online platforms that allow an investor to independently evaluate the case and decide whether or not it's something that they want to do.
Okay, so you would take then the Warren Buffett investment strategy here, or would give that investment advice?
Which is
essentially invest in the basket. That you, as an average retail investor, can't possibly have expertise on any of these individual firms, and so your best bet is to just invest in the S&P 500, invest in the market. And so your best bet is to get exposure through a delegated portfolio manager.
Yes, my advice would be go to you could invest through Burford because they have stock. So that's great for an investor. That's nice and easy. And if you believe the Burford story and you believe that their stock is priced appropriately, you can invest in the industry that way. Or you can go online to one of these platforms and read the case and decide whether or not that makes sense to you.
But you wouldn't, but that is investing.
Personally, I would not do that, no.
Okay.
No, I would put most of the money that comes in is from family offices or pension funds. So it's all indirect there. So to the extent you have exposure there and it's part of a diversified basket, that's the way to do it.
Okay.
Or due diligence, if you're big enough, due diligence on a particular outfit that you have confidence in and give your money to them.
Okay. And so wait, actually I want to jump in here. So is there anyone, so I wrote this case on Burford, and I want to talk about investing in Burford as a stock.
Okay.
And just a few warnings there.
Maybe
so,
I should have.
So first, no, this is great. I'm glad that you brought them up. So look, I wrote a case on Burford, but is anyone from Burford here? Anyone here? Yeah, we have a Burford member here. Okay.
Oh, excellent.
So would you mind just like putting your hands over your ears or like walking around pretending you don't hear this part? Okay. So this part, yeah, exactly. So look, here's the problem about investing in the stock of something, and I'll do it with an anecdote. So there's this hedge fund manager, John Polson, right? The Polson School of Engineering, Polson. And everybody knows this big trade on housing. Yeah, you got it right, that's fine. Housing went up, it went down. Okay, here's another trade that he took on, and that has to do with gold. Okay, and so what he wanted to arbitrage away was this difference between the underlying, which are gold price, and then even these ETFs, right, or these other securities that traded on gold itself. So he said, hey, this is a great way to get exposure, but there's some dislocation between them. That just means that they didn't kind of move in the same way. And so the problem with a publicly traded stock is that it doesn't have to move the same way as the underlying asset, right? And so in order for that to be true, you need perfect pass-through. And no publicly traded stock has perfect pass-through. In other words, what they could do, what Burford could do, and I hope they're not doing this, right, is they could say, hey, we're going to go out and we're going to get you exposure and we're going to make a ton of money, and then we're going to pay ourselves even more money, right? And then we're going to get awesome jets and we're going to get like a great office and we're going to do a bunch of other perks such that the end investor actually sees almost nothing. Okay? And in that case, the litigation finance market could be doing wonderfully, and yet you as the end shareholder don't see that correlation that you want to see. So that can cause big dislocations as opposed to just investing directly or investing through a fund. And so in thinking through the right way to get exposure, sometimes that stock can be very dislocated from the underlying, and it can last for a very long time. So this trade that Polson made, by the way, his gold trade, so he's very well known for the housing trade. It's getting a little, now it's warming up here, okay? Now we're getting into a little dicey topics. Okay, so this trade that he made in gold, it turns out, even if he was right, okay, and fundamentally, even if he was right, he was wrong in the duration. And that being said, he lost a ton of money, okay? And so he eventually had to exit this trade because he lost so much money on the eventual convergence of these. And the same could be true of investing in Burford. Even if you're right, that this litigation finance market is super hot and you don't want to be able to bet on a certain case and so you just want exposure, you could still then end up not making as much money through the publicly traded firm or not making any because of this issue that you're one step removed, right? That you're giving someone money in a way that's not like a fund manager or even not like investing in the underlying asset itself. And so that's one thing to keep in mind in these different kinds of exposure, that they're slightly different and they actually require you to do slightly different things, right? Require slightly different amounts of trust.
Right.
Trust in the asset, trust in the manager, and then trust in the fact that they're going to delegate and then, especially in a publicly traded firm, then allocate those costs and things correctly.
So today, lots of litigation funding has become very popular with, say, the Harvard Endowment, Yale Endowment, smaller schools, because of its potential for higher returns and because of the lack of correlation with the capital markets. And that's what you see. And I would say that all of those endowments and the other source of cash being family offices to funds come and basically do extensive diligence on the managers and make that bet. And they don't want to take the crapshoot of the public markets and the disconnect between the asset class performance and the performance of the company that is running it. But they much prefer the fund model, and that's the way it's done today, and that kind of in a big macro view trickles down to the various individuals who are benefiting from those companies. We look at it at Arrowhead as when you invest in a case, it's like doing venture capital in legal cases. It's exactly the same thing. You have early stage, you have late stage. We do a structure that is very much similar to what venture capital expects, and we have the same dispersion of returns. You know, we invest in 10 cases. Quite frankly, we expect that we're going to out and out lose a few of those cases. We're going to do okay on a couple of them, and hopefully on one or two we're going to do really well. And that's the business model.
Can I add a few things that are different from what you've heard from Lauren and from Wynn. Number one, I think that the STP formula is good, but doesn't include what perhaps is the most important factor, which is awareness and understanding of the industry. That is key to any investor, and it is key to any claimant, and it is absent almost entirely from this industry. Why? Because the industry is young, the industry is changing like the wind, and the industry has risk involved, which everybody says is inherently uncertain. All of that means that people don't understand the industry. The industry is no different from private equity or venture capital in that it is investing in an asset. This asset is not a company, it's a claim, it's a commercial claim. That can be valued and that can be analyzed. But the fact is, most people don't know a thing about it because they're unknowable. The industry is so still. I think that the mortal enemy of this industry is lack of knowledge and lack of understanding. It's always been that way. It will be that way for a while. However, that's changing. Why is it changing? Because some of the myths, well, first of all, one of the things that's changing about it is what's going on today. People are starting to really pull back the layers and understand more about the industry. That's number one. Number two, litigation itself has become big business. It's as much a business now to litigate a major claim as it is to buy a company that you feel is going to appreciate and value. This is really big business. And what's happening is that people have been hurt in the market, they've been hurt by others, and they're starting to invest in this market. Now, what does the market yield? Well, if you do it right, even if you do it wrong, you're looking at figures that mean 3 to 1 on capital invested within 2 to 3 years. That's a lot of money. Burford has published its IRR over the last 10 years or 9 years, and that's been 30%. Now, if that's accurate, that's a lot of money of a return. They've posted an ROI of something like 800% or 700%. That's a lot of return. It's very profitable if it's so. Now, the industry in general is profitable even with its defects. Now, what are some of the defects? One is risk. People like Wynn, and he doesn't stand alone, people in the industry say, with some justification, that risk is so great, is so immeasurable, that I can charge whatever I want, whatever the market will bear. Well, the fact is, the risk is not that great. In reality, you have technology, as you're learning about today. You have algorithms, you have neuropsychology, neuroscience, you have psychology, you have different things that are being used to demystify this risk profile, which is minimizing the risk, and it is measuring it in a way that's never been done before. If you want to, you can choose a case that's already gone to judgment and have a lot of the risk taken away. If number two, the fact is that the risk is measurable, and therefore prices can be rationalized. You can, if we had an economist here, you can measure better the pricing, and it will be measured better in the future. You know where this is going. This is not a matter of mystery where this industry is going. It's going to be much more price sensitive, much more measured in price, and the prices will come down, become more standardized, and the profits will probably go up, because the real profits here are not from the IRRs, but from the overall amount invested and returned. So if you invest $1 million versus $100 million, and you make on $100 million twice what you invested versus 10 times on the $1 million, you've made a lot better by having a lower IRR or a lower return on your investment. That's where the key is, how much money is invested. And the portfolio investments and the investments in big cases are going to continue to swell. They're already huge in terms of the popularity with companies like Burford, and they're returning a lot of money. Now, the market itself can be defined in a way in generalities. We can say, for example, that the demand is high compared to the supply. You heard a second ago that there is more of a balance between the two. I don't think so. You look at Burford, you look at Lake Willans, you look at others, Woodford, and they say they're selecting maybe 3% or 4% of the cases they have applying for funding. Well, that's not, that's an indication that the demand is still very high compared to the supply. Then you say, well, how fast is demand growing? And you hear, like you'll hear from Woodford today, that the markets are growing. You see in emerging countries are starting to grow in funding, and that is growing faster than the hurdles allow the supply, even though you do have now more funders who are coming in that are not institutional funders, but hedge funds, private equity, family offices that are starting to invest in this. Still, there are hurdles that we can talk about, like conflicts, that slow down the capital infusion. The demand is going to continue for some time to outpace the supply. So where does that leave you? You leave that with the notion that you have a risk that's being measured. You have profits and policy and pricing. And where that will lead depends on the policy in good part, because there is a huge opposition to funding, and this is going to be my last remarks, from the defendants' side, the Chamber of Commerce. And what they say is, this is all well and good, you're serving the public, but you're flooding the courts, but you're putting cases into play that are scam cases, that are frivolous, that are hold-up cases. You're violating some of the ethics rules, or you're at least running that risk. All of these things can be answered, and in fact, at the end of the day, that has given, as I mentioned before, more publicity to the industry. But you're going to see that sort of policy. There will be regulation, there will be transparency, and the transparency, for example, is going to help the funding. The more the other side knows that there is funding involved, the better off the claimant is and the funder is, because it puts the fear of God into the defendants for a lot of reasons. So
I think-
you will see transparency, you will see regulation, but again, this is going to help the industry, not hurt it, because the regulation will make it good for the good funders and bad for the bad funders, and that will be, it'll be better for the claimants as well.
I think this is a good point to open up to questions from the audience. And JP, can you pass the mic around? Awesome. Maybe while we do that, a small point, I mean, and this is maybe too creative, and then we can kind of go away from that, but what we were describing earlier about the equities, right, and how that the fact that you can't really invest in the underlying asset well if you're buying Burford stock, that's not true by definition, right? I could issue shares, a la ICO, coin offering, that lets someone buy directly into a case, right? Do you think that is at all realistic? I mean, I guess the Lexshares model is similar because it is this crowdsourcing thing, but I don't know if that's interesting to you. I don't know if that's interesting to the audience, but I'm curious to know what you'd say to that.
Yeah, look, I think that's a great warm call. So we'll ruminate on that. We'll take some Q&A.
Excellent, let's do that, yeah.
At the end, for sure.
Hi, how are you, gentlemen? I'm Walter Haydock. I'm a second-year student at the business school, and I've got a question about the state-of-the-art of pricing. And Mr. Seidel, you alluded to using algorithms to identify and quantify the risk. That's something that I'm personally very interested in. Would you be able to elaborate a little bit more on exactly how, to the extent you can, that risk is quantified? Are there quants applying machine learning to previous case outcomes? Are they looking at statistics? Would you be able to speak more on that, please?
I'm delighted, first of all, that you're from the business school. You're a student at the business school. That is a big plus. Second, your question is right on the mark. The fact is that there is a lot coming into the industry which allows for better measurement. Big data is one big example. You can, in the patent area, for example, you can take the cases and take a look at them before a particular judge, if you have the case already brought, and you can see what that judge has decided in the past, and you can make some predictions about how he'll treat or she'll treat your case, number one. Number two, you can apply different algorithms that give you some idea of, with these combination of features of this case, how it might come out. You can hire a neuroscientist to read that judge's hardwired mind and be able to predict better how he or she might decide the case. You can use the game theory of Harvard Law School has pioneered, in fact, through one of your professors, to determine what the behavior will be for the jury, for example, if it's a jury-tried case. So there are many different tools that are either non-existent or very early on that will, in the future, I think, allow you to better predict what's going on. And in fact, if you looked at the established industries, the venture capital that Wynn mentioned, if you looked at hedge funds, if you looked at private equity, you would see a lot of parallels to the way they analyze cases because they're doing the same thing that investors are doing here by investing in different features of businesses. So it's an excellent question, but I think you can answer it very much by just looking at what's been done in other industries and then trying to figure out what might be done in this industry.
All right, let me take a crack at this. I, for one, think that the application of big data and algorithms in litigation ultimately is a fool's errand. I don't actually think at the end of the day that it helps you that much. Law firms have been trying to figure out how a judge is going to think, how a jury is going to think, to figure out the outcome. Because the thing that makes this asset class particularly unique is that at the end of the day, a judge or some other type of decision maker is going to make a choice between the case that you, the funder, have backed and the defendant. And they're going to make, so all of this predictive stuff is trying to get into their heads. And we've certainly been presented with decision tree analyses that purport to be very analytical and scientific in their approaches to your probability of success based on various things, but I'm pretty skeptical that it's going to get much beyond where we are today, at least for the types of cases that are not, I don't know if this is a word, aggregatable. You know, you can put all together and run a statistics on. The stuff that we see are complicated things where somebody has a story on one side and somebody has a story on the other, and somebody ultimately, you know, isn't telling the truth, and somebody's got to make a decision as to whether.
Here's the difference between Wynn, who has had, and I respect him, he's one of the best funders in the country, but he's dead wrong about how to predict a case. I litigated cases for 40 years, and believe me, you can predict how a judge might read a case. You do your homework before you go to trial before this judge, and you determine what that judge thinks about X, Y, and Z, or what he's had or she's had for breakfast. You can really make a projection from that, and I might add, the industry as such opposes that, as Wynn does. Why? I think, and it's just a personal judgment, I think the reason they oppose it is because it takes some of the mystery out of the claim and out of the industry's investment, and therefore allows the industry to charge more than they would otherwise charge by saying, look at this risk. And I don't expect Wynn to definitely agree with me on that, but I think that's the fact.
All right, well, obviously I have to defend myself a little bit.
No, you don't.
The only thing I would say is that I just don't think that it's going to change much from what it is today. Right? Today, Selvin's absolutely right. People do a lot of analysis to figure out what the judge had for breakfast, what the judge has done before, what the arbitrator's predilections are. We certainly do that today, but I don't think the science of that is going to advance in any particular area, in any particular way. I don't know, what do you think, Law?
I mean, I'm just having a great time listening to you. I mean, maybe we should get out jousting sticks, and this is fantastic.
Yes, sir.
Don't know, wait a second, we'll get you the mic.
You've got to break it down. I'm sure in the 40 years of litigation, you knew, I can tell you, judges that get a case, they're going to dismiss it because they don't like plaintiff's cases. It's very difficult to get certain judges, and you know that kind of thing. But if you're putting money into a case that's going to get through a motion to dismiss, and the case I've been talking to you about is one that's already gone to the top court of the Court of Appeals of New York, so you know you're going to get to trial. If it's a jury trial, there are plenty of techniques to take a survey of the jury, do this we're going to do focus groups. We'll do mock trials, and we'll know. And in cases that are important enough that you're going to do that kind of effort as a lawyer, you could come in early on and say, I'll invest in this case because we've done a survey of the jury pool, and we can see what the attitudes are. You're never going to get a certainty, but you'll have something that you could measure. You can't measure at the beginning and say, I'm going to invest so much money into this type of case safely, because we don't know the variation between lawyers, because no one's ever studied that. Is it regulated or not? An insurance company can tell you what's going to happen. That's how they write. That's how they underwrite liabilities, liability insurance. So I think that you're being,
Well,
Yeah, so
I
wait,
mean,
I just want to quickly cede both parts of the shark fight, and then I want it to go on again. Okay, so let me say something to kind of support both here in this dimension. So look, one of my favorite results in law and economics in probably the past 10 years was that this was an Israeli court, and this was a judge who saw, multiple cases again, I think tens of cases a day, and there was one predictor that could significantly predict the judge's decision on this case. And that predictor was not any attribute of the case, but it was how close the case was to when the judge ate. So it was much nicer right after lunch, right after breakfast, and got much meaner as the day went on when he had low glycemic. Yeah.
It's like Wynn.
And so, look, there are things that you can measure, and that's great. And then you can measure, you can quantify, and that will help you predict these things. That being said, look, I'm a quantitative analyst, right? I consult for hedge funds. This is what I do on the equity side, fixed income side, and I'll say, here is the illusion, in some sense, of measurement. And that is, we think if we can measure it, and now that we can measure much more, that will help us predict things better. When, in fact, it turns out there might be a ceiling on our predictability here. So it turns out we might only be able to describe and to be able to predict 30% of the variation in these cases, right? Like maybe there is 70% that really is random, right? Or that really is case specific, that nothing we can do will help us predict it. Right? It's like trying to predict the news or macro events. We have no idea what's going to happen tomorrow because the world has no idea, right? If some world president or some trade or some natural disaster comes in, that changes everything, and there's no way we can predict that. And in the same way here, we might not be able to predict what's going to happen in these cases. And so the more we can measure and the more these things that come up that are quantifiable, they actually can't get us above that 30%. And so in some sense, there might be a part of this that we can never predict, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't keep trying to use the quantifiable things we have.
I agree entirely.
And so wait, I don't want you to agree. I want you to go back at it. Come on, guys.
Well, I think if I'm going to go back at it, I agree with you. I would just say the 70% that you've broken it down to is wrong. I think it's higher than 30%. It might be 50, 55%, but there are parts that will be unknowable, but that doesn't make any difference. You should do as much as you can, and you will earn a whale of a lot of money as an investor if you can narrow it down. Wynn himself said, look, if I have losses or break-evens, but a couple of cases are out of 10 really hit the bell, I'm okay. Well, that's fine, because you can make a ton of money as an investor now, and you can help the market by putting more money into this industry. I would just disagree with you on the percentages. I think you're dead right on the facts, but,
But you could settle that if you would consult some actuaries. Because actuaries have answers to the questions.
I think you mentioned, Jared, that actuaries and insurance might be comparable. I disagree with that also, because I think they're based on numbers that you can put together and you can spit out. This is a bespoke industry. It depends on an analysis of a particular claim or claims in a portfolio that is much different than betting on insurance, which is numbers, I think.
Well, then you need both actuaries and statisticians.
Okay.
But all I'm saying is I'm doing one-off kinds of things. If you're going to predict, you have to satisfy statistical rules. And you need people that are experts in it, who are the actuaries. And actuaries, for some reason, that profession got left out of the hedge funds, left out of the private equity area, but they have the best information about how long someone's going to live, even though you can't tell me or you what it is for us, and provide you with the kind of information that you're looking for in order to pick out what you can pick out to fund. And I don't think, is there any funder here that says that they have an actuary on staff or they have a statistician on staff?
I don't.
Burford have that?
If anybody does, they do.
Burford does? Yeah, yeah, Burford does.
Should we open it up to another question? I think there's one slightly.
Maybe one more?
One more.
Way to go, JP. You're really earning your living.
So I guess I'm Hunter Fortney. I'm a joint degree student here between the law school and the business school. When you're talking about the future of the industry, do you see it kind of, it seems like one vision of the future of the industry is more like how private equity is now, where it becomes more institutionalized. You have a series of asset managers who raise larger pools of capital, and but there's no real, within the particular transactions in the industry, there's no real standardization. Each buyer and seller sort of negotiates on an ad hoc basis. There are sort of industry norms, but it's sort of a less regulated thing between the two. Do you see that as the future, or do you see it something more standardized where it's like a mortgage contract that's bespoke, or that it's set up for future securitization?
Well, if you look at the industry from today, who is involved? You have a lot of lawyers, and you have a fair number of finance professionals. Those are the people who are occupying the space. I'm a corporate lawyer by background. I'm not a litigator. So I came at it from a structured point of view and spent a lot of time developing the contract. I remember sitting down to fund our very first deal. I started with a blank piece of paper. I said, okay, who are the parties? What are we trying to do here? I went on the internet. I looked all over the place. I found some old Burford case. It was a complete mess. There was a lousy model. There was a woman named Maya Steinitz who had come out and written a legal article on, I forget what it was called, but it was kind of a standardized contract approach that allowed me to think conceptually about what to do. We put together a contract on the business side. Okay, so that's the contract between us, the funder, and the recipient of the funder that tracks what are you investing in, how does the money come in, how does the money get distributed, what happens during the period of the case if something goes wrong. Those are kind of the outlines of what we're trying to deal with on the contractual side. You need lawyers to do all this evaluation that can be done qualitatively, ultimately decide on whether your case is going to be a winner. So I think the successful investor, and by investor I don't mean an individual, I mean the company that is whether it's Burford or Arrowhead or Ethereum or whatever the company is, that is making the investments. The successful investors manage to meld a finance approach which respects how to motivate people and how to have returns be fair or perceived as fair by all the participants in the transaction, and the lawyers who do the analysis on picking the right cases and making the decisions in the end. And so I don't know if that really answers your question, but those are the people and the skill sets that are involved, and the folks who are able to bring those together, I think, do well as funders, and the folks who just have a bunch of litigators on one side or a bunch of finance professionals and no litigators, I think run into trouble. At least that's the way it looks for us.
And so do you want to jump in?
I can just add that in my view, and by the way, I used to be a funder, institutional funder, but today I'm an investment advisor, so I don't have exactly aligned interest with anybody. But I think that Wynn's focus on the lawyers is very good, in that the lawyers are the beginning and end of a case. They're the ones that analyze the case before an investor goes into it, and then they prosecute the case, both of which are critical to the success. But it's not only the lawyers. You have financiers and business people who have to look at this case just like they're looking at any other investment, and it is an integrated profession. This is law without walls, as Harvard has used the term, because it's an integration of law with business, with finance, with other professions like accounting, and together they come up with the analysis of how good this investment is. Yes?
Yeah, can I just add one thing before this? And so look, let me say this. If you view this in the private equity framework, then you're going to have a natural floor for the size and type of case that you can fund here, right? Because it doesn't make sense in this private equity framework, it doesn't make sense, given the amount of time that they tie up capital and the amount of capital they need to deploy, to invest in anything less than an X million-dollar company, right? Whatever that is. And that means that pizza shops aren't going to get funding from KKR, these other private equity, like there are lots of places where private equity is needed. That is to say, where private debt is not the right type of financial contract or the right type of investment, and yet they're not being funded. Whereas what's nice about these cases is that you have this huge number of cases that are smaller, but that don't make sense for maybe a firm to get into just because their size doesn't justify the demands put on the cost put into them, but that should be funded, right? And that have a positive NPV if you can figure out a way to do those smaller cases. And in this type of asset, I think you can. I think there's promise to do it. Given its nice duration properties, even relative to like a pizza shop or some of these other private equity, you actually can have a good feel for when this is going to resolve. And especially if you get later in the case, that you can kind of know, gosh, we are going to have payouts that actually accrue over the next 6 months or 12 months or 18 months. Given that low duration, these things should be funded, and they can. And so if you're the investor that figures out a way to fund these smaller cases, and that's going to mean you take let's just call it maybe a diligence light approach to them, because you have like 6 variables that if you can measure those, then you can fund these. But you're going to need to take then 100 of those cases or 1,000 of those cases and create a giant portfolio in order to do it. If you're the investor that can figure it out, then there's a lot of money to be made here, because that's purely white space. And so in that sense, I think kind of both approaches can work. For the larger cases, it might need to be a more private equity approach. But for these smaller cases, I think there's a huge amount of white space for a different approach.
Lauren is putting his finger on the future of a part of litigation funding. A part of it is not going to go where it has gone in the past, which is investing anywhere between 1 and 10 million in a case, which has 100 or 25 million or $1 billion projected return. But there is a market now that's starting and is going to grow for small cases. That is under $1 million, under $500,000 of investment, under $100,000 investment. It's just starting, and it's going to grow because it's been neglected. Crowdfunding is an example of where it is already developed a bit, and it is going to be a significant part of the industry, I think.
This is a perfect transition to the question I had, which was on the size of the market. If you look at what are the prospects for growth, you have to have an idea of what's the latent demand for winning cases that is not being met today by the funding. And that's exactly what you were heading towards. How big do you think this is? That is, how much cases are winning cases that cannot get money today to be fought?
Well, you have, there's no doubt that the market is growing and big, and statistics are hard to come by. But in terms of litigation funding, there are some jurisdictions where the market is pretty mature. And what does mature mean? It means that any case that comes in, people think about whether it is eligible for litigation funding, and there are tons of funders out there willing to fund. So what are those markets? Australia, the UK. There's actually...
So these are geographic markets, not just...
These are geographic markets.
Like a certain type of case within those markets,
Exactly.
or just markets in general?
Markets in general.
Oh, yeah.
So if you go to the UK, there's a report, and Tim, you're very familiar with this, by, I think it's Lord Jackson came out with it, right? It's the, and they have this concept of access to justice. And litigation funders are access to justice in the UK, especially in which is a jurisdiction in which if you lose, you have to pay the other lawyers fees. And if you're suing a big company, just imagine they hire Freshfields or somebody like that who charges over £1,000 an hour for their lawyers, and you can rack up a pretty big liability. So you have to find funders who are willing to assume that risk. And I'd say every case that comes up in the UK, whether it's a very small case, and there are a bunch of funders who focus on very small cases, or a big case, people think about funding. And then you switch to the United States, where we heard earlier about the survey results, about just the awareness of funding, and it's going up exponentially, and partly because we do not have a loser pays system. Litigation in the US is by far the biggest litigation market in the world. And I hope we come to a day in which all funding is viewed as an alternative for all cases. We have an established contingency bar here in the United States, so even today, I mean, pretty much all personal injury cases are done on a contingency fee basis. And why, I'm going to take a shot at the Chamber of Commerce, why you can object and say you're fomenting litigation by having funding, as opposed to you're fomenting litigation by having a contingency fee system is kind of beyond me. Funding, I think funding is going to become part of the way lawyers go to their clients and say, hey, this is a way to get it, to get your case into court, and the market, I don't know how much is spent on litigation here in the US, but it's a lot, and I think
2% of gross. 2% of our gross.
I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it's big.
It's big.
So.
Let me agree with Wynn for a change. First of all, the fact is that funding is hot in the U.S. because we don't have adverse costs, and because we have juries with big eyes for damages and for a few other reasons. It's started in England in 2000 and has been steady there. The adverse cost hasn't stopped it, and in fact, it's a strong market. In addition, you have Germany, you have France, Paris for arbitration, you have Hong Kong and Singapore for international arbitration. You have a number of countries in South America, like Brazil and Peru, that are going into it. You have India standing there waiting to jump into it. They're already ready to do it. You have a number, you're going to hear from Woodsford about emerging markets, Africa and so on, that are ready and going to be next in the queue. So this is an industry which is growing in terms of acceptance and even popularity. So you're at the very start, even though it's grown like wildfire in the last since 2009 when Burford came in, and 2007 when Juridica came in with Tim. It's growing like wildfire now, but we will not have seen anything until the next 10 years are under our belt.